Ed, Cinda Kostiak and her associates put together some very interesting questions for this interview. One had to do with today's role of public relations executive as opposed to the way it was when you were reigning in your job at AT&T. Would you like to comment on that? There's been a lot of changes. So many have changed it to communications, and the advisor role has diminished. What's your view on that?
Well, I can give you impressions. Obviously, I'm retired, and so you perhaps can take what I say with a grain of salt, as we used to say. But first of all, the field of corporate public relations, business public relations, is clearly far, far more complex today than it ever was before, and continues to become more so. And that's had on the one side, I suppose it's good for jobs in the field and the kinds of work that you have an opportunity to do that wasn't there before. But the dark side of that, to me, is that it's distracting from what the core notions about public relations were in our day. So, in our predecessors, because it was much more the counseling function as really a continuing day-to-day job. And now you have marketing communications, and you have all kinds of communications. I'm waiting to see in the Wall Street Journal any day now. It's going to say somebody has been elected vice president blogs, and but you've got the whole internet stuff, the skills necessary to keep a fresh website and our websites. So it's really stretched, but in the stretching, I think some of the core benefits, values, not as a moral thing, but values in terms of the corporation getting what it's paying for, are lost when the too many people in the public relations organization, including the chief, are spending too much time doing other things. Now, another piece that I think has made the job more difficult is, of course, in many companies, it's the globalization.
Right.
When you're trying to be a counselor in a cross-cultural environment, it probably can't be done without a lot of help or a lot of associate counselors. But in any case, and the customer base tends to be different. The CEO's travel schedule is a double the monster it was when you and I were there. So I think to sum up my impressions is, yes, it's changed vastly. It continues to change. I want to see it come back with a little more emphasis on the counseling function, without necessarily giving up some of these other functions. I do think in some PR departments there are too many functions that really don't need to be there. I mean, they're there because it makes a great looking organization chart, but it's not. Anybody else can do some of those things, or they could be done somewhere else. Also, the decentralization has been another problem for the CEO's advisor, by whatever title, because if you have these very large, discrete, and rather independent business units, and that really are in business for themselves. I mean, too much so. I always marveled at General Electric. that how could they do such a good job, which they have mainly done through the years of a coherent face to the public and a definable character. You know, when you're building jet engines, you're building refrigerators,
Right.
light bulbs, medical imaging, locomotives. You know, that's quite a feat. You know, because those businesses really don't, for the most part, have any overlap. I mean, they're different industries. You know, and yet the General Electric has been able to be GE.
So you have companies that have become infinitely more complex, and you have public relations vice presidents who have a lot of eggs in their basket, some of which probably shouldn't be there, because if you're going to sit on that basket and keep track of all that's going on, you don't really have time to spend with the CEO in an advisory capacity.
Yeah.
And then you have the situation of the CEO who might have been weaned away from the counseling and is either getting it elsewhere,
Find someone else,
or
to
not
do it.
getting it, the counseling that he should.
Right.
Some of the major headline stories that we've all suffered through in recent years, you rarely find the public relations person having had a culpable role in those situations. Enron. Did you find it that way too,
Yes.
that they weren't among the
They weren't in the loop.
indictees? Or
Right,
they
well,
weren't.
they weren't indicted. That's good.
Yeah, that's a positive.
But they weren't in the loop.
They weren't in the loop.
Yeah. And I just, another thing in talking about this basket of eggs that a chief PR officer has to deal with, and pulling that person away from the other job. The same executive that laid the one on me about this run like a mom and pop corporation. Another canny thing that he said to me in a whole different context, different situation. He said when he was then, in this episode, he was assistant to the chairman, which is a job when he retired that I took on in addition to the PR job. But he said, when people ask me what I do, he said, what I do, I'm paid to think about things the chairman of the board doesn't have time to think about. Meaning that the CEO is pulled and tugged here and there, and there are so many balls in the air, and there are potential problems down the road. And what he was saying is that I have the luxury of seeing the world through the lenses of a CEO, my boss, but I have the luxury of being able to think ahead about things that he needs to be aware of. And I'm not talking about crises, but just things that he needs to be aware of and plan for, and we plan for it together. And I thought that was a pretty good way to put it. So if you're you don't need to have a separate job, assistant chairman of the board. I'm not arguing for that, but if that's in the chief public relations officer's portfolio, and it should be, don't let it get crowded out, and I think that's part of what happens, or has happened. And also, the CEO's job changed, and I'm happy to say now that I'm encouraged that it's sort of changing back again with some of the new breed CEOs. But what also happened along the way was that too many cases the CEO became the chief salesman to Wall Street.
Yes.
Every 90 days.
Yeah.
And
trying to meet the quarterly.
yes, yeah. And so the CEOs also got off the rails
Right.
in many cases. And but as I said, I'm somewhat encouraged. Some of the new ones that have come in on the scene, some in the wake of scandals and some not, seem to be a different breed. That they're running the business, and therefore they are open to the kind of PR person that we've been talking about here, to help provide the counsel to run the business. I mean,
Right.
these there were two. I probably shouldn't get into books, but there was about 3 years ago a wonderful book called Execution, written by the CEO of I guess it's Allied, what used to be Allied Corporation. Is it Allied Bendix, is it, or something like that? And he straightened that company out one time, and then he retired, and it went off the rails, and they brought him back. And this book was the piece about that. And he said when I came back, he said everybody was rushing around going to conferences and meetings, and there were these big charts up on the walls and all these new opportunities. And he said, I looked at that and said, stop it. You know, we have a business plan.
Yeah.
Execute it.
Yeah.
Do it.
Yeah.
You know, and we'll change it when we need to. So what I see in some of the new ones, I'm thinking about the new CEO of Hewlett Packard,
Yeah.
and others that are picking up on the fact that when you get too big in the head, when your salary is, or your compensation is what most people know about the company, you're headed for trouble.
Yeah.
And what you need are executives with a longer term view, and executives who know where they want to take the business, and it's not down to Wall Street, you know.
Right. And there's another aspect that we haven't touched on, and that is the personal relationship between a CEO and someone who is aspiring to be a counselor. And my advice on that would be, if you sense that the CEO doesn't really like you, or if you always seem to be on divergent paths, it's time to look for another job. Ed,
By the way, just a footnote on that. The counselor, one piece of a good counselor's character, you have it, I think I had it, is humility. I mean, understand my job is different from the CEO's job.
well, I always knew who was CEO,
Yeah.
but I get low marks on humility, I'm afraid.